can you make fake Pokemon in Blender? Over the past few years, I've made 3D models of a bunch of different fake Pokemon, from unused beta Pokemon to baby Pokemon that never existed. All of them are made with Blender, and today I'll show you exactly how I did it. I'll be walking you through the process of modeling this Pokemon, Draither, a fake evolution of Dragonair that was designed by Ken Draws Art over on Twitter. Let's start off by downloading the Dratini and Dragonair 3D models. You can download pretty much every Pokemon model from the models resource. All of these models have been ripped directly from games, and I think they're a great learning tool. You can see how AAA developers model their characters and how they use textures in clever ways to make the games more efficient. Let's bring Dratini and Dragonair into Blender and try and get something rough in place. At this stage, all I'm trying to do is use simple shapes and just kind of Frankenstein this model together. This is called blocking out. All that matters here is that we get the shapes in place and we can see the model coming together. It's not going to be pretty and it doesn't need to be. This is pretty much 3D sketching. All of this is placeholder. All I'm doing here is taking the Dragonair model and breaking it, making it longer, turning the ear feathers into horns, duplicating the ear feathers and using it for the tail and back feathers. In this case, I'm lucky that I can use the Dragonair model as a base, but in some other cases, like this forgotten Pokemon Bombseel, I had to create it from scratch, which isn't too difficult, it just takes some time. As I said, at this early stage, the model will be ugly. It's supposed to be quick and dirty. We can worry about refining things later in a process called re-topology. Re-topology is the process of refining, or in most cases, completely replacing our rough model with a smooth and optimized model. The reason we do this is because it makes working with the model easier, texturing will be easier, and finally, and probably most importantly, it reduces the number of polygons that Blender or a game engine has to render. Most game engines render everything using triangles, and our model is made up of thousands of them. That model will then probably be moving on screen, so for every second of gameplay, the game engine has to calculate and move every single one of those triangles, so it makes sense to reduce the number of triangles on screen, as that will hopefully make your game run faster. That's why the most recent Pokemon games have been, well, rough to say the least. In built-up areas with lots of characters and buildings, there's going to be a lot of triangles on screen, and if the game engine doesn't handle them correctly, then you'll encounter glitches and slowdowns. As a character modeler, we don't want to contribute to that any more than necessary, so that's why we re-topologize. Re-topology is probably the most time-consuming part of this whole process, but it can be very relaxing. I like to put on some music or a movie and then just turn my brain off and start joining the faces together. I like to think of it as a puzzle. You know certain areas need to be connected together, but it's just about figuring out the best way of connecting them. Re-topology is one of those you either love it or hate it type of things, and I personally love it. After the re-topology is finished, we can start working on the textures and materials. There's a few different 3D Pokemon styles you can go for. You have X and Y or Sun and Moon, which use pretty basic cell shading with an outline, Sword and Shield, which is mostly cell shading with a hint of realism, Legends Arceus, which has a painterly feel to it, or Scarlet and Violet, which has removed the outlines completely and is going for more realistic materials. I personally like the cell-shaded Pokemon games like X and Y, so that's what I'll go for. As I mentioned before, all of these Pokemon models are available on the Models Resource website, so let's look for some X and Y models and see how they make their textures. As you can see here, all of the models have some shadows drawn onto the textures. You have the main color, then the shadow color, and then there's a small blend between these to create a slightly smoother shadow, so 3 shades in total. Sometimes this is a technique used in games to add extra dimension to the models. One great example of this is actually the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Cloud's color texture is actually really simple. It's pretty much just uniform colors everywhere. The detail you're seeing is actually an extra shadow pass on top of the base color. Sometimes games call this a shadow map or an AO or ambient occlusion map. Games running on console, and especially the Switch, have to be extra careful with where they allocate resources, so adding some baked shadows to the texture is a great way of removing any extra shadow calculations that might affect the performance, and it produces a more reliable and consistent result from scene to scene. Another thing that's very important for Pokemon is the eyes. By looking at the official models, you can see that the eyes are a completely separate texture, and there's a bunch of them, some blinking, crying, or happy. This is known as a texture atlas. The game engine uses these different eye textures and cycles through them at different stages to make the Pokemon blink or flinch in battle. It's a very simple technique and it's very powerful. In fact, pretty much every retro game uses a texture atlas or a sprite sheet to animate the characters. For this model, however, I don't need it to blink, so I just made the eye part of the main texture, which isn't a bad thing. It's just about knowing what the model will be used for, and in my case, this is just a static render, not a playable character in a video game. Now that our textures are finished, we need to work on the materials, and in this case, a toon shader. The toon shader is one of the easiest but most useful tools for non-photoreal rendering, or NPR for short. It allows you to create stylized renders that look like they're drawings, even though they're 3D models, and there's actually a full website dedicated to Blender NPR style renders called Blender NPR. Anyway, to make this toon shader for our Pokemon, we need to start off with a basic diffuse shader. We don't need to worry about reflections or anything like that, so just use the diffuse shader, then plug this into a shader to RGB node. This is where the magic happens. The shader to RGB node does exactly what it says. It turns our shader into RGB information, which is just color, and we can manipulate color very easily by using something like a color ramp node. Set the blending to constant to create those sharp shadows, add another segment so that we have white, grey, then black, then plug the output of this into the factor of a mix RGB node. Now we can plug our base texture into the top, set the bottom color to a shadow tint, then change the blending mode to multiply. Now you have some Pokemon style shadows. Lastly, we want to add the outline to our model to match the X and Y aesthetic, and this is one of the easiest steps. All we need to do is add a new material to our object, make it a black background shader, and make sure the backface culling is turned on in the settings. I'll explain that in a second. Now add a solidify modifier to the material, making sure that it's pushing outwards, then flip the normals and change the material to slot 1. Now you'll see your outline. So backface culling is a method used in game engines and 3D software like Blender to hide the inside faces of the model. Each face of your model has two sides, also known as the normals, and backface culling basically hides the inside faces of the model. But by flipping the normals of the solidify, now we're actually seeing the outside of the solidify as the outline. Yeah, I know it can get confusing to understand, but just know that if you want an outline in Blender, just remember these three things: solidify, flip normals, backface culling. Depending on your model, you might have to jump back and forth between the different steps. Like in this case, I rushed the blockout stage and didn't really map out the feathers correctly, so I had to pose the character first and then add in the feathers. So now we have our fully modeled character, but it would be nice if it looked a little bit more alive. This is where rigging and animating come into play. Rigging and animating are their own skill sets, and you can specialize in either of them. But as modelers, it's good to know a little bit about them, as if you were working in a team, you should be modeling in a way that makes the animators' lives easier. Rigging can be very simple, but can also get very complex. And for this, I don't want a lot of movement, so it's going to be pretty simple. This Pokemon looks majestic, and it's also fairly big, so I just want some subtle movements. All we're doing with the rigging is putting bones inside our character, and then telling Blender that when we move the bones, we want the model to move as well. This is how all video games and animations work. This process is called skinning. Yeah, I know it sounds gruesome, but it's just a way of mapping the skin of the model onto the bones, and then the animators move those bones to make the characters move. Most games run at either 30 or 60 frames per second, so I want my animation to be a nice simple 120 frame loop. 120 frames should give us about 4 seconds of animation, and that's enough to give us a nice simple breathing animation. This type of animation is also known as the idle animation or idle state. If you want your animation to loop, all you need to do is set the end frame in Blender to 1 frame less than the length of the animation, so in this case 119. This will mean that the end frame and start frame are exactly the same so that it loops perfectly. You might need to play around with the graph editor and change the easing method for the first and last frames, but it entirely depends on the animation. And finally, we have our fake Pokemon, Drather.
Drather, the psychic dragon Pokemon. It has split its consciousness and placed it in the pearls it adorns itself with. This allows it to keep its mind awake while its body sleeps.
You can get fancy like I did here and make a fake Pokédex entry, but that's not necessary. I just think it completes the look and it makes it look a bit more real. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you, but hopefully you've learned some things, and now you should be able to bring your own fake Pokemon to life. So, can you make fake Pokemon in Blender? I think so.